Hi, everybody. I am gonna do a lecture. My husband's gonna take Danny on a bike ride, but I just wanted to say hi and show you the cutest part of lecture. Say hi. Hi. All right, I'm gonna start this. Um, so we're gonna be doing a lecture on the Cold War, kind of introducing a new topic. I'm going to get through this as hopefully quickly and succinctly as possible. There's some things that I'm sort of like trying to leave out. And some things that I'm trying to include. There are 3 assignments for this week. My goal is that this lecture will be about 20 minutes, and then you'll have the 3 assignments, which I don't think should take you too long. 1 discussion, and then 2 source analysis assignments that are all due on Friday. So let's jump into it. I'm going to just present this. So I want to talk about the Cold War, which begins directly after World War II comes to an end. So, we talked about the decision to drop the atomic bomb, and pretty much as soon as that decision was made, it pretty much launches us into the Cold War. The reason that it launches us into this Cold War is because there's this incredible mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. Similarly to after World War I, a lot of Europe was devastated. In England, even more so than after World War I. France, D-Day, the invasion at Normandy, the battle for Britain. I mean, and then everything that was going on the Eastern Front, much of Europe was destroyed. And so the United States comes out of it, again, in a pretty powerful position, and they use this atomic bomb, which was incredibly threatening. Nobody else had that kind of technology at this point, and so Stalin hated it because he had this huge red army and he had been working to industrialize Russia after all these years, and an atomic bomb renders that useless. The United States doesn't trust Stalin because even though he technically was their ally for the second half of the war, he technically had an alliance with Hitler first. And so, they're like, there was a lot of mistrust there, and then just like the differences in ideology: capitalism versus communism, private ownership versus state ownership, democracy versus a totalitarian dictator. Stalin himself even said capitalism and communism are incompatible and another war is inevitable. So you guys can just see that there was just all this like tension and mistrust between the nations. But after the war comes to an end, they formed the United Nations, which was sort of like the League of Nations 2.0. It was supposed to be and is the better version of the League of Nations. They actually met in San Francisco, and 50 nations joined. The goal was to promote peace. So it actually is established as an official organization. The downfall is, though, that both the United States and the Soviet Union kind of used it as a platform to spread their influence. So they would sort of gather their different countries that were under their control or that were their allies or lined up with them, and sort of use it as this. It was sort of became very divisive, even though it was supposed to be there for peace. So the United Nations is formed, and there's all this serious tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but the end of World War I still had to be negotiated. So just like at the end of any war, you had a conference. This one was the Potsdam Conference, where they negotiated the official end of World War II. This one was not done to just punish Germany. They kind of learned their lesson a little bit after World War One. So Germany was divided into four sections, and England, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union were all given control over different like sections of Germany, and they were in effect supposed to help them rebuild their nations. So all of these are the different sections that they controlled. So Germany is divided, and they're supposed to help them rebuild, but Stalin kind of uses this. Oh, you guys can also see Berlin here was also divided into four different sections. Um, Berlin is in the middle of the Soviet Union section, but what ends up happening is it becomes sort of like a Stalin uses, you guys can see he gets kind of this eastern part of Germany, and Stalin ends up sort of adding that to all of these other Eastern European countries that he had liberated in the war. So Stalin pushed Hitler back in this direction. So, like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, all of these kind of like smaller countries here, Romania, all these different countries that are sort of along here in Eastern Europe. And he just took East Germany and added that into this sort of like group of nations that he controlled. He pretty much said he wanted a buffer zone, meaning like he wanted a physical land barrier, these nations to be a buffer so that it gave him a break from the rest of, he didn't ever want the Soviet Union to be invaded by a Western European country again or any kind of enemy. So he was like, I want to keep these as a buffer zone. The goal was to reunite all these four sections after the war was over. That's not what ended up happening. What ended up happening is Stalin kept his after they reunified theirs. So pretty much after that happened and he refused to unite his portion, you guys can see here some of the areas that he refused to give up. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and then East Germany kind of falls in with that. It was after that the United States begins their policy of containment, which is where obviously they're trying to contain the spread of communism. It's pretty self-explanatory. And Winston Churchill makes his famous speech that the Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. So you guys can see, I mean, it's not a physical Iron Curtain, but he's like saying this line sort of divides the democratic West and the communist East. So pretty much after the United States establishes their policy of containment, they start doing a couple of things to contain the spread of communism. So one of the things they did is they actually sent $400 million in aid to both Greece here and Turkey here, because both Turkey and Greece did not want to become communist. They didn't want to. You guys notice here for this Iron Curtain, Romania and Bulgaria are part of his sort of like puppet governments. Greece and Turkey are here. So they did not want to become communist, but they were, you know, sort of almost behind. Turkey's definitely behind the Iron Curtain. Greece is sort of like skirting on the edge. And so the United States sends $4 million to Greece and Turkey in aid, and then they also send all these former kind of boats and planes and things just to sort of help them fend off Russian pressure. And the whole Truman Doctrine, as he said, it's the United States' responsibility to support free nations that are resisting outside takeover. Essentially, what he's saying is if the Soviet Union and communism is trying to take hold, it's our duty to help you resist. And they were effective because Turkey and Greece do not fall to communism. So Truman Doctrine was very influential in that. And then the second thing that was very influential that they launched was the Marshall Plan. So June 1947, the United States launches the Marshall Plan, where were able to give $13 billion in aid. They offered it to all of Europe, including the Eastern European countries that Stalin, that were sort of like those puppet governments that were the sort of the buffer zone that Stalin wanted. Western Europe was in chaos, and a lot of times when countries are in chaos, they start to turn to radical ideas. And the United States wanted to make sure that they didn't turn to communism because they wanted, obviously, Western Europe especially to be their allies in this kind of Cold War. So over 4 years, 16 different countries received $13 billion in aid. And it was so significant. You guys can see here, there's they sent food, they sent all sorts of stuff. But communism lost its appeal because they were able to sort of stabilize Western Europe. And it was so significant. Interestingly enough, the United States offered money to all these Eastern European countries, but of course Stalin refused, even though they desperately needed the aid, because how bad would that have looked to be like, I mean, pretty much was like he can't provide or help these countries, even though he had no real intention of doing so. It's still one of the reasons why Eastern Europe looks different than Western Europe does, and their economies and stuff took many, many years to recover. So in terms of Stalin's sort of like buffer nations, he also this was more of like the actions of like a petulant child kind of, but he refused to give control of Berlin, because if you guys remember, Berlin was in the middle of his section of Germany, and so he blockaded Berlin to try to like sort of like, well, blockade these sections that belong to England, France, and the United States. And then he sets up a wall here over his section when he was like, I'm not going to give up this portion. So he blockaded his entire section. It ends up being incredibly unsuccessful, and it kind of is like embarrassing for Stalin, because you guys can see, so here's Stalin's portion, here's Berlin where he blockaded, and the Allies, all they did, England, France, and the United States, pretty much it was like every couple minutes they launched a plane from their areas and they dropped in supplies. Not to say that Germany wasn't suffering, or Berlin, people in Berlin weren't suffering during this time, but a blockade becomes completely ineffective if somebody is just dropping in supplies over your blockade. And Stalin didn't have he didn't really want to engage directly with United States planes, and so he didn't really do anything to stop it, and so the blockade failed. And so this was sort of like a bad look for Stalin, and sort of embarrassing for him. And sort of, I don't think it helps at all with the tensions, though, because it probably just makes him even more upset. And then the United States officially, kind of like they make it official, where 12 nations all form an alliance together, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, where they promised military support in case of attack. This is so significant because this is the first U.S. military peacetime alliance. The United States had never gotten into an alliance that would pull them into war. Think about World War I, think about World War II, every time they joined later. This time, if there was an attack, they were going to be pulled in automatically. So this sort of ends their hope for isolationism that they had kind of pulled off during World War I and World War II, at least at the beginning of each of them. So it's very significant. So it seems like the United States is forming their alliances. There's, been victories. The blockade failed. The Marshall Plan worked. The Truman Doctrine worked. Turkey and Greece didn't fall. And then boom, May 1949, China falls to communism. The United States had been aiding Chiang Kai-shek, but Chiang Kai-shek was very corrupt. And he brutally treated the peasants in his country. And so, the peasants turned to communism and Mao Zedong. You can see here. This is so significant because China is a huge nation, and they're this like gateway I mean, obviously it's a part of Asia, but sort of a gateway to like the Pacific. Russia obviously is connected to the Pacific, but all those sort of Pacific islands, China kind of can become this launching point to try to influence all these other Asian countries. And this is where the United States begins to develop this idea, the domino theory, where they were worried like if one country falls to communism, more will follow in East Asia. And so China falling to communism was incredible. It was a huge blow for the United States. And then just a couple months later, the Soviets successfully test the first atomic bomb. So now it is not just the United States that has nuclear power, now the Soviet Union does. And so now you don't just have one superpower, you have two superpowers that both have nuclear capability. This begins the nuclear arms race, and both countries start spending exorbitant amounts of money to build the next biggest, more powerful, or just even more quantities of bombs. So this obviously incredibly instrumental in escalating the Cold War. So the interesting thing is, though, that the United States, they had the nuclear bomb. As soon as Russia or the Soviet Union gets the nuclear bomb or has nuclear capability, the rest of the Cold War sort of like plays out in these little proxy wars. And I know I talked to you guys about this last year, but these little proxy wars kind of start breaking out where the United States and the Soviet Union don't want to face each other head on because they can just start a nuclear launch all their nuclear weapons and start this nuclear winter and just destroy the world. So they have these little proxy wars where either allies of the two countries are fighting, or they're sending money while one group sends troops, or they send weapons or whatever. So they sort of like these little conflicts that play out. And the first one that really plays out is the Korean War. If you guys notice, so technically after World War II, because Japan had taken over Korea, Korea was split into two sections. The Soviet Union had control of North Korea, and the United States had control of South Korea. It was divided about at this line here. You can see this 38th parallel is where they divided it. So North Korean troops decided to try to take over the entire peninsula and make it a communist nation. So they attacked and they pushed U.S. troops all the way down to the Busan, to the very south of Korea. The UN forces then come in. So you have North Korean troops fighting against American and kind of UN troops. So it's not Soviet versus the U.S. at this point. They pushed North Korea all the way back up. Then China, who had fallen to communism, aids North Korea, pushes back to just a little past Seoul, South Korea, and they finally agree 3 years later to an armistice line, the DMZ, which you guys have probably heard about still to this day, this demilitarized zone. They agree to this line and they say, okay, let's have the North be communist and the South still be under U.S. influence but be a democratic nation. This was incredibly frustrating because it was 3 years and there were 54,000 Americans that were killed. It cost the United States $67 billion, and the war started at the 38th parallel and pretty much ended exactly at the 38th parallel. But this is just an example of one of those proxy wars. Some people considered it a victory because they're like, at least all of Korea didn't fall to communism. And we all know the fates of, or I guess the difference between South Korea and North Korea. even to this day. So very significant. So all of these things are sort of ways that the Cold War is playing out. You guys have 2 assignments on this. So you have the Cold War origins, where it just sort of goes over like how the Cold War started, and there's some questions for you to answer, including looking at this perspective of who started the Cold War. So this is kind of like to the Soviet Union, this is how the US looks. To the United States, this is how the Soviet Union looks. So you guys are kind of looking at those different perspectives, and then there's also a discussion assignment where you choose one of these events that we just went through and say which is this like kind of most significant in escalating the tensions and which is the least significant. But I'm going to continue lecturing and talk to you guys about how the Cold War impacted the United States at home. And I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. So we're just going to look at kind of the Cold War at home. So the arms race, like I told you guys, the Soviet Union and the United States both sort of like race to compete to build the next kind of more powerful bomb. So the United States builds the first H bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and the Soviet Union the very next year builds an H bomb, and so which is 67 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. So this kind of cartoon sort of jokes about like how these both sides have all this like incredible capability to really destroy the world, but they're firing bows and arrows at each other because they can't use these bombs because of what they know will happen to the world. So a lot of people were frustrated, especially in the United States, about why are we spending so much money on this, and it was just a real source of frustration. But that was not the only race that was going on. Because they couldn't use these weapons on each other, they decided to try to compete in like every other area. So they tried to compete like with culture. So like you know, the Bolshoi Ballet, the Soviet ballet, which was incredible. They went on tour around the world trying to say, look how great and high class and wonderful our ballet is. The United States sent singers like Louis Armstrong to say, look at this amazing music that's coming from the United States. But it really was this campaign for international prestige. So this campaign to win the respect of the world and the kind of awe of the world. So the space race was one of the biggest areas that this plays out. Both nations were racing to launch a satellite that would circle the globe, and the Soviet Union wins. They launched Sputnik. This is Sputnik here. You guys can see it was a satellite and it circled the globe every 96 minutes. You guys could see like the red blinking light on the satellite. They launched it October 4th, 1957, and this absolutely terrified Americans because they were like, they could literally get out in their perfect little like cookie cutter neighborhoods, walk out, look up in the sky, and see this like blinking red Russian satellite above them. And they were like, they can launch a nuclear weapon from the sky, they're spying on us, and it just was absolutely terrifying for Americans. So they actually launch, there's a couple things that they launch. They're convinced that they have to be stealing secrets from the United States. They're like, how are we losing in this space race? How'd they develop a bomb so quickly after we had one? So they formed 2 organizations, the Loyalty Review Board, where they targeted government employees. There were 3.2 million investigated, and there were 212 that were dismissed out of suspicions that they were like communist. This was focused on the government, and then there was the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which is known as HUAC, and they investigated other areas in the United States. They were most famous for investigating Hollywood, where people would report if you had like communist leanings or if you had some sort of like connection to the Soviet Union or and pretty much people would report on you, and they would call you in, they would question you, and then either you would give other names or that you would clear suspicion or whatever. But there were 10 famous writers and actors that actually refused, and they were sent to prison. They refused to participate in the investigation. And overall, there were 500 actors and producers that were blacklisted, which in Hollywood, well, you don't ever really want to be blacklisted, but it pretty much meant that they had no jobs. And if you hired them, then you would be assumed, they would be assumed that you were guilty as well. So really, people lost their careers because of this. And this like sensationalism and fear is only escalated by this guy here, Senator McCarthy. You guys can see in a news press, he actually holds up this piece of paper and says that he has a list of hundreds of names of communists that have infiltrated the United States government. And Americans freak out. They're like, no way. I mean, they were like, who are these people? And they were like, okay, well, Senator McCarthy, who's on the list? Who are the names? And he was like, well, I'm going to launch investigations and the names will be forthcoming. Couple months pass, nothing really happens. He gets on TV again and says, okay, I have a list of about like 80 names. And they're like, okay, well, what happened to the like hundreds? But it's okay. I mean, 80 is still a lot. Who are they? And pretty much like it becomes clear after a while that he doesn't really have any names. And so he kind of just like adds to this feeling of paranoia in the United States, and people really didn't know how to trust. And then the very last thing that kind of like cherry on top in terms of this like paranoia and fear was the fact that they actually found spies. These people that they found were not high-ranking government employees or anything like that. This was literally, so here you can see a picture of them, Ethel and Julius. So Alger Hiss actually was the first to be actually imprisoned, and they were convinced that he had sent secrets to the Soviet Union. But he was actually, so he was arrested, and he never actually admitted guilt. So he was actually released years later. But Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, this was like just like your neighbors that you might see next door that lived in the house next to you. They seemed very normal, just this like normal couple. And then it comes out that they had been passing secrets. Julius, the husband, had, and then they said that Ethel was sort of like an accomplice to him, helped him type up memos, etc. So they actually were sentenced to death. They were passing secrets to the Soviet Union, but they were sentenced to death. And a lot of people, they're executed in 1953. The craziest thing is that people were like, if Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are Soviet spies, it could be anybody. So again, it just adds to this feeling of paranoia. And if we were in class, I would play a really fun game right now that's always like a super fun highlight where we try to figure out who is a spy in the class. But, we got to do what we got to do. So kind of like the last person I want to focus on in this lecture is John F. Kennedy and the election of 1960. So all of this is going on during the Cold War, and the question becomes, who is going to lead the country going forward? Is it going to be Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy? Richard Nixon was a Republican. He was an expert on foreign policy. He was very involved in foreign policy under the previous president, and he had worked very closely with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the new Soviet leader. John F. Kennedy was a Democrat. He was young. He was only 43 years old. He was Catholic, which we had never had a Catholic president up until this point because they were worried that their allegiance would be more towards the Pope than to the United States. But anyway, so he was Catholic, mark on his record, according to Americans at that time. But the significance and the reason I'm talking to you guys about this election is that it was the first ever televised debate. And this is significant because of this. So I want to show you guys. Here's John F. Kennedy, and here's Richard Nixon. Every debate prior to this election had been on the radio. And like I said before, Nixon was an expert on foreign policy. He had tons of experience, and probably would have been well suited to handling things during the war, except for on television. You guys, JFK looked really young and handsome and had this like great smile. And in the debates, he looked super relaxed, and you guys can see here, like really kind of casual, relaxed. He was joking around, and Richard Nixon looked really nervous, and not his fault, but Nixon was a pretty sweaty guy. And so he kept, you guys can see here's a picture of it, he kept wiping his face because he was sweaty. So people overwhelmingly said in this election that they felt like they couldn't trust Richard Nixon. So JFK kind of wins over the hearts and minds of Americans, and he wins the election. And so it's interesting because he, there's this image. These are kind of have been recolored photographs, but he had his beautiful wife and his children. There was this image that he was sort of this all-American guy, and he's the one that's going to lead America out of this crisis. I can't play it for you guys right now because it'll copyright my video, but I would strongly recommend that you guys go watch this video on YouTube. It's Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday to the President, because even though this image was like this perfect life and happy home, Marilyn Monroe is just one of John F. Kennedy's affairs that he was having. Marilyn Monroe also slept with John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby, but another story. Anyway, watch this video. It's ridiculous. The most ridiculous happy birthday you've ever heard in your life. Feel free to message me with laughter afterwards if you want. But JFK had to figure out how to kind of prepare the United or lead. Sorry, not prepare. I mean, they were in the middle of it, but lead the United States through this. Another recommendation I'm going to give you guys is to watch just the first couple minutes of Duck and Cover. This was actually initiated by the Civil Defense in the United States in 1951, so very early in the Cold War. It was a defense film that was shown in classrooms. Every single classroom, every single student in the United States had to watch this video to sort of prepare themselves for nuclear attack. So if you guys love earthquake drills and fire drills as much as I do, you guys should really take a watch of Duck and Cover. Just the first couple minutes or even 2 minutes. Just do it. Again, feel free to message me. So John F. Kennedy is this new president. He's trying to figure out how to lead the United States through this situation. And he gets news that American surveillance planes have discovered Soviet nuclear warheads in Cuba. Cuba was under the control of Castro. It was a communist nation, and JFK already had a disaster kind of very early in his presidency with the Bay of Pigs. That's one of the things I'm kind of skipping over. Can't really get to, but just assassination attempts and overthrow attempts of Castro in Cuba. But guys, Cuba is 90 miles south of Florida, if you had forgotten that. So if there are Soviet nuclear warheads in Cuba, that's a lot different than being launched from there as opposed to them being launched from the Soviet Union. So the news gets out about this, and this begins a few days of incredibly tense negotiations. This was by far the closest that the United States had ever come. The world had come to an all-out nuclear war. And the question is, who's going to act? Who's going to move? Are we going to get to war? Or are we not? Who is willing to go to the edge of all-out war, and can we get out of this with negotiations? And so that's the last assignment that you guys have, is to look at why did the Russians pull their missiles out of Cuba? So what made this situation end? Why did we avoid the Cuban Missile Crisis being an all-out nuclear war? So I want you guys to really pay attention. You're going to look at declassified memos and then and information that came out later about these sort of like delicate negotiations that were going on between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, and also his brother Robert. So you guys, that is it. I know that was a lot of information. Good thing you can pause me and take notes or do whatever you need to do. But those are your 3 assignments. That is all for this week. And